Muy buenas tardes con todas y con todos. Invito al doctor Waldo Mendoza, vicerrector académico, y al doctor Eduardo Ismodes, vicerrector de investigación, a acompañarnos aquí en el escenario. Muy buenas tardes, doctor Waldo Mendoza, doctor Eduardo Ismodes, estimadas, estimados docentes, estudiantes, personal administrativo y público diverso que nos acompaña. Sean todas y todos ustedes bienvenidos a la ceremonia de inauguración del Encuentro Anual de Investigación, Innovación y Creación. Mi nombre es Alejandra Vieira, soy especialista de creación del Vicerrectorado de Investigación y tengo el honor de acompañarlos esta tarde. El encuentro se llevará a cabo desde hoy hasta el 21 de septiembre y reunirá a más de 300 expositores entre investigadores, innovadores y creadores, en más de 120 actividades de diálogo y difusión de nuevos conocimientos y saberes de todas las unidades académicas de nuestra universidad, donde reflexionaremos y formularemos propuestas para mejorar nuestra sociedad. Invitamos al podio al doctor Eduardo Ismodes, nuestro vicerrector de investigación, quien nos va a compartir unas palabras. Ahí.
Doctor Waldo Mendoza, vicerrector académico, distinguidos investigadores aquí presentes, muy buenas tardes. Es para mí un honor dirigirme a ustedes el día de hoy para celebrar este nuevo encuentro anual sobre investigación, innovación y creación. En realidad, creo que este es un gran mérito de las personas que hacen el trabajo de investigar, innovar y crear. La universidad funciona porque hay gente que hace cosas y el vicerrectorado lo que trata es de facilitar el que éstas sucedan. Llevo casi 2 meses en el cargo y por lo mismo debo destacar que lo que se va a mostrar el día de hoy, consecuencia del trabajo de investigadores, el día de hoy en todos estos 21 días, el trabajo de investigadores, innovadores y creadores, es mérito de la gente que ha apoyado el que se hagan estas presentaciones, que es el personal, y es mérito también de la administración anterior, que está acá presente el doctor Aldo Panfichi, y que ha contado con la Dirección de Fomento de la Innovación, el doctor Carlos Silva, acá presente. Entonces, para toda la gente, todo el equipo que ha realizado este trabajo, pido un aplauso especial. Gracias. Quiero destacar algo interesante. Entre el año 1999 y 2002 fui director académico de investigación de la universidad. No existía el vicerrectorado. Aún veo algunas caras que en esa época nos conocimos. En esa época, el presupuesto anual, el año 99, de la Dirección Académica de Investigación rondaba los $80.000 para toda la universidad. El presupuesto del CONCITEC no llegaba a los $3 millones para todo el país. Ridículo. Increíble. El año 2006 publiqué un libro denominado Países sin futuro. En realidad el título debió ser Países necios, pero me pidieron que si lo iba a publicar la universidad no colocara ese título. No sé qué fue peor, pero en el libro hablaba de lo importante que era invertir en investigación, desarrollo, innovación. Y de esa época, en la que se invertía tan poco, ahora hemos pegado un saltito. No un salto grande, hemos pegado un saltito. La situación es bastante diferente. Si el año 2006, cuando publiqué el libro, hubiéramos convocado un encuentro como este, hubiéramos sido 20 personas, posiblemente 30 a lo más. Pero el año 2008 se aprobó un fondo especial con apoyo del BID para promover la investigación, desarrollo, la innovación. Además, destinó un fondo especial también para promover la innovación desde el lado de las empresas Todo esto lo manejó un solo organismo, el MINCIP, y así de repente, de una cantidad casi inexistente de dinero que se invertía en investigación, en innovación, desarrollo, se pasó a un estado mejor, un estado del cual gozamos el día de hoy. Sin embargo, ese pequeño salto ha hecho que de invertir el 0.08% del Producto Bruto Interno en investigación y desarrollo, ahora invirtamos el 0.17% del PBI. El promedio latinoamericano ronda el 0.66%. China, el año 2001, invertía alrededor de 0.8% de su PBI y tenía un plan ya desde entonces de cada año ir aumentando 0.1%. Hoy en día China ya supera el 2% de inversión en PBI, 2,5% me parece que ya va. Una cantidad astronómica cuando la multiplicamos por el PBI chino. Y para que tengan una mejor idea, si Estados Unidos invierte alrededor de $1.600 por habitante en investigación y desarrollo, si Israel invierte 1.600, Corea del Sur otro tanto, bueno, el Perú invierte en dólares contantes y consonantes alrededor de $20 por habitante. La comparación, a pesar de ese saltito que hemos pegado y de pasar de 6 a 8 dólares pasamos a $20, es todavía muy poco respecto a lo que tenemos que hacer como país. Y en ese país tan complicado destaca la labor que está realizando nuestra universidad. Nuestra universidad, con la gente que hace la investigación, la innovación y la creación, con la gente que ayuda a que esto funcione, que son las personas del vicerrectorado y de distintas unidades de la universidad. Y lo que queremos mostrar en estos 21 días es justo qué está resultando, qué están consiguiendo nuestras personas. Y he hablado de investigación, innovación y creación porque creo que ese es otro mérito destacable de la gestión anterior. De una reunión con todos los profesores que hacían este tipo de actividades, se acordó que ya no se iba a hablar solo de investigación, sino que era importante incluir innovación y creación. Si mal no me equivoco, fue hace 4 años que se tomó esa decisión y desde entonces ha habido encuentros anuales donde el primer discurso era de investigación, el segundo año de innovación, el siguiente año de creación y ahora retornamos al tema de investigación para el discurso inicial. Pero mostramos algo que pocas universidades están haciendo. Estamos mostrando resultados de actividades en 3 ramas clave. En el pasado, como consecuencia de la reforma universitaria del Grito de Córdoba del año 1917-18, cuando todo un movimiento muy fuerte en Córdoba, se fue acordando y se fue imponiendo en todas las universidades que era importante hablar de investigación, que la universidad no se quedara encerrada en sus 4 paredes y que hiciera extensión. Y se acordó y se generó ya la idea de que toda universidad debía dedicarse a formar, a investigar y a hacer extensión, o actividades que ahora llamamos de responsabilidad social universitaria o transferencia. Bueno, eso fue hace ya más de 100 años. Al día de hoy, las cosas han cambiado un poco. Ya no puede hablarse solo de investigación, hay que hablar de más. Y por eso nuestra universidad, al igual que unas pocas universidades en Latinoamérica, ya está fomentando como un paquete junto lo que es investigación, innovación y creación. Y lo que queremos mostrar son esos resultados. Y queremos que esto se transmita y se conozca en otros lugares. En estos 21 días van a ver el resultado de ese trabajo, impulsado directamente o más fuertemente desde los departamentos académicos, desde los centros o institutos. Un reto, y hay retos nuevos, hay cosas que añadir a lo que se ha hecho al presente, es cómo involucrar a las facultades, cómo hacer más fuerte lo que ya también se inició hace 2 años, el trabajar más fuertemente entre el Vicerrectorado de Investigación y la Escuela de Posgrado. En la universidad, con esa idea antigua de trabajar formación, investigación y responsabilidad, no se ve que esos 3 caminos tienen que comunicarse entre sí. Tenemos que conseguir por ello involucrar más a las facultades y a los cursos de posgrado para que todos sean parte de algo mismo. Y formar sirva para el pregrado, para tener alumnos que generan tienen un mejor pensamiento crítico, no creen cualquier tontería que les dicen en los medios, piensan, investigan, entienden y pueden también proponer soluciones innovadoras, pueden hacer creaciones que hacen que nosotros disfrutemos de la vida. Y hacia ello estamos yendo, como una universidad que abre camino, abre paso. Hoy día el presupuesto de la universidad dedicado a estos temas de investigación, de desarrollo, innovación, creación, ya no es esos $80.000 con los cuales empecé en el año 90. Ahora supera los $10 millones en lo que es recursos propios y otro tanto variables según lo que consiguen los investigadores, a veces más, a veces un poco menos, de fuentes externas. Hemos pasado a otro nivel y el resultado se ve en cómo hemos ido mejorando en los rankings. Sin embargo, no hay que quedarnos dormidos en ello. Hay muchísimo más trabajo que hacer. Tenemos que convencer al país de que tiene que invertir no más, sino muchísimo más de lo que ahora hace. Pero esa mayor inversión debe ir pegada con producir mayores resultados. Entonces, estamos en un proceso, en un camino en el cual tenemos que ayudarnos entre todos los que creemos que esto es importante. Tenemos que mostrar los resultados de lo que hacemos en publicaciones científicas, en libros, en distintas formas de producción de lo que lo que se haya investigado, en generar resultados mejores para la sociedad vía las innovaciones, en generar emprendimientos, empresas, a consecuencia de lo que hayan hecho las personas, y para ello tenemos que fortalecer lo que son los grupos, los equipos, y conectarlos mucho más fuertes con los centros o institutos. Y esto que estamos proponiendo hay que hacerlo como un modelo que pueda ser replicado en otras universidades, porque el que nuestra universidad tenga éxito no es nada. Y por ello, en este encuentro además vamos a contar con la participación de la Universidad Nacional Toribio Rodríguez de Mendoza, una universidad que tiene resultados espectaculares en ciertas áreas del conocimiento y que nos va a mostrar lo que está haciendo. Tenemos que ir creando más lazos con otras universidades que están en la misma línea que nosotros y al final conseguir que este no sea un país sin futuro, que este sea un país en el que vale la pena vivir, y vale la pena vivir porque nosotros desde la universidad estamos colaborando a ello. Muchas gracias y espero que disfruten de este encuentro.
Muchas gracias por sus palabras, doctor Ismodes. Ahora invitamos a nuestro vicerrector académico, el doctor Waldo Mendoza, a brindar las palabras de apertura del encuentro.
Doctor Eduardo Ismodes, vicerrector de investigación de nuestra universidad, doctor Aldo Panfichi, vicerrector anterior de nuestra universidad, estimadas y estimados amigos, colegas, estudiantes, invitados del país, invitados del mundo. Es grato para mí darles la bienvenida al Encuentro Anual de Investigación, Innovación y Creación 2024, que cada año organiza el Vicerrectorado de Investigación de nuestra querida universidad. Este evento, que ha crecido y evolucionado con cada edición, se ha consolidado como un espacio clave para el diálogo y la reflexión en torno a los desafíos y oportunidades que enfrentamos en nuestras disciplinas y en nuestra sociedad. Durante las próximas semanas tendremos la oportunidad de participar en más de 120 actividades programadas, donde más de 300 expositores de renombre compartirán sus conocimientos y experiencias. Este encuentro no solo es un escaparate de los avances en investigación y creación que se desarrollan en nuestra universidad, sino también una plataforma para la colaboración entre la academia, el Estado, el sector empresarial y la comunidad internacional. Además, como lo ha dicho nuestro vicerrector de investigación, este año contamos con la presencia especial de la Universidad Nacional Toribio Rodríguez de Mendoza de Amazonas como nuestra invitada. Un reflejo de nuestro compromiso por fortalecer los lazos y promover el intercambio de saberes y experiencias que enriquezcan a nuestras instituciones y, en última instancia, a nuestra sociedad. Quisiera destacar la diversidad y la relevancia de los ejes temáticos que guiarán nuestras discusiones, desde la ciencia aplicada hasta la sostenibilidad y el bienestar. Estos temas reflejan nuestra responsabilidad como investigadores y creadores para abordar los desafíos más apremiantes de nuestro tiempo y contribuir con soluciones que mejoren la vida de las personas. En nombre de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, agradezco a todos los organizadores, expositores y asistentes por su compromiso y entusiasmo. Estoy seguro de que este encuentro será un éxito y que de aquí surgirán ideas y proyectos que marcarán una diferencia significativa en nuestra sociedad. Les deseo a todos un evento lleno de inspiración, aprendizaje y colaboración. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Mendoza. Lo invito a usted y al doctor Ismodes a formar parte de nuestra audiencia. A continuación, es un honor para nosotros invitar al escenario a la doctora Asfa Majid, profesora de Ciencias Cognitivas en la Universidad de Oxford, quien presentará la conferencia magistral Nuevas miradas a la relación entre lenguaje y pensamiento, y al doctor Roberto Sariquiei para la moderación de la conferencia. Adelante. Los recibimos con un fuerte aplauso. Roberto Sariquiei es doctor en lingüística por la Universidad de La Trobe, Australia. Actualmente es profesor principal del Departamento de Humanidades PUCP y fue becario del Instituto Radcliffe de la Universidad de Harvard. Ha colaborado y liderado varios proyectos científicos y sociales sobre lenguas amazónicas, como el Cacataibo, el Isconagua, el Amahuaca y el Chipibo-Conibo. Es además director de la Estación Científica Chana de nuestra universidad. Doctor Sariquiei, lo dejo a cargo de la conducción del evento. Y a nuestro estimado público les recuerdo que si cuentan con preguntas sobre la conferencia, pueden hacerlas llegar escaneando el siguiente QR que se encuentra ahí en pantalla. Ahí pueden colocar todas las consultas que tengan y el doctor Sariquiei va a recibirlas y hacerlas a nuestra conferencista magistral. Los dejo.
Gracias, buenas tardes con todos y con todas. Un saludo a las autoridades de la universidad y a todos ustedes. Me toca a mí presentarles el día de hoy a una colega y amiga, muy buena amiga, que es aquí la doctora Asfa Majid. Así que primero voy a empezar leyéndoles un pequeño texto en el que más o menos describo algo de su trayectoria. Y luego voy a hacer algunos comentarios un poco sobre la relevancia y repercusión de su trabajo y también sobre lo que ha venido a hacer al Perú. Entonces, Asfa Majid es profesora de psicología en la Universidad de Oxford, es graduada de la Universidad de Glasgow y la Universidad de Edimburgo en Escocia. Asfa pasó 17 años en los Países Bajos, en Holanda, primero en el Instituto Max Planck de Psicolingüística y luego en la Universidad de Radboud, donde formó parte de uno de los grupos más potentes e interesantes dentro de la lingüística cognitiva en el mundo. Luego de eso regresó al Reino Unido, donde estuvo trabajando en diversas universidades y ahora, como saben, es profesora de la Universidad de Oxford. Forma parte de varios comités internacionales de revisión y de edición en varias revistas. Por ejemplo, es editora de Science. Así que, Asfa, tienes que ayudarnos a publicar artículos en Science. Y ha recibido varios premios por su trabajo que cruza las fronteras entre la psicología, la lingüística y la antropología. Entre los premios que ha recibido se incluyen el premio Jeffrey Ellman por logros científicos y construcción de comunidad, el premio a modo KNAW, que es una iniciativa conjunta de la Fundación A Modo y la Real Academia de las Artes y Ciencias de los Países Bajos, el premio Radboud Science Award, otorgado por la mejor, más importante y más estimulante investigación científica, el premio Drongo Science Life, por compromiso público en el mayor bueno, es miembro electo de la Sociedad de Ciencias Cognitivas. Creo que este micrófono no estoy. ¿Aló? A ver ahora, sí, creo que ahora sí. Es miembro electo de o electa de la Sociedad de Ciencias Cognitivas y Fellow de la Asociación para la Ciencia Psicológica, así como miembro electo de la Academia de Europa. Creo que cuando hice esto todavía no había sido nombrada miembro de la Academia Británica de la Ciencia, que es algo que suele pasarle más a los hombres que a las mujeres, y suele pasarle más a las personas que están a punto de jubilarse que a las personas que están en el medio de su carrera, así que es un logro bien importante, para realmente admirable. Y bueno, pasando un poco a su investigación, ASFA investiga la relación entre lenguaje, cultura y pensamiento, llevando a cabo estudios con adultos de diferentes culturas y grupos, y rastreando cómo se desarrollan los conceptos a lo largo de la vida de los niños en diversos contextos culturales. Su trabajo adopta un enfoque intercultural a gran escala que busca establecer qué aspectos de la categorización y de la cognición humanas son fundamentalmente compartidos y cuáles son específicos de una lengua o una cultura en particular. Su trabajo se caracteriza por la interdisciplinariedad y combina experimentos de laboratorio con trabajo de campo, estudios lingüísticos en profundidad y descripciones étnicamente o etnográficamente informadas. Un poco para darles un poco más de contexto sobre la relevancia del trabajo de ASFA, no sé si ustedes han oído hablar alguna vez de la hipótesis Sapir y Whorf en lingüística, que es una hipótesis a la que se le suele llamar la hipótesis del relativismo lingüístico. Sapir es un gran lingüista americano, para mí uno de los lingüistas más entrañables, y su alumno y su discípulo Benjamin Whorf era un tipo con ideas locas sobre cómo funcionaban las lenguas, que se propuso escribir una gramática del Hopi, que es una lengua utoazteca hablada en los Estados Unidos, en sus propios términos. Y terminó formulándose la pregunta de si efectivamente las diferencias entre las lenguas, no sé cuántos están familiarizados con algunas de las preguntas de la lingüística, pero si piensan, por ejemplo, en el español y en el chino, es muy fácil notar que son lenguas muy diferentes. Una es tonal, la otra no, una tiene palabras muy cortitas, el español tiene palabras un poco más largas, o incluso pueden pensar en el quechua, que tiene palabras incluso más largas, y en fin, hay lenguas que ponen el sujeto al inicio, hay lenguas que ponen el verbo al inicio de la oración, hay lenguas que ponen el objeto al inicio de la oración. Entonces, lo que se preguntaba Benjamin Whorf era si estas diferencias lingüísticas implicaban formas distintas de pensar y formas distintas de percibir y comprender cognitivamente la realidad. Y él creía que sí. Entonces él pensaba que lenguas con sistemas de tiempo donde no había marcación de tiempo en el verbo podían tal vez tener una concepción diferente del tiempo en términos extralingüísticos, o lenguas en las que existen 17 o 23 deícticos como aquí, allá. En lugar nosotros tenemos aquí, este, ese, aquel. Hay lenguas que tienen 17, hay lenguas que tienen 20 de estas palabras. Y él se preguntaba si esto tenía una implicancia para la forma de pensar el espacio. Esta fue una línea de investigación que tuvo mucha importancia en la lingüística americana de los 40, de los 30, 40, 50, hasta que viene Noam Chomsky y desarrolla un modelo lingüístico en el cual el lenguaje era el resultado de una categoría innata, de un componente innato de nuestro cerebro que se llamaba gramática universal. Y la característica fundamental de la gramática universal es que estaba independiente de cualquier otro sistema cognitivo. No tenía ninguna dependencia con la memoria, con la percepción, con la capacidad de abstracción, sino era un componente dedicado a producir el lenguaje. Entonces eso hizo que Worf fuera humillado, vapuleado, ignorado, considerado un loco, y lo que pasó con la lingüística es que se volvió una disciplina monolingüística, donde se creía que uno podía hacer generalizaciones sobre el lenguaje humano a partir de una lengua, a partir del inglés o a partir del español. Y esta visión monolingüística, monocultural, tuvo un impacto muy grande en la psicología. En la psicología y en las ciencias cognitivas, básicamente todo lo que sabemos sobre cómo pensamos, cómo comprendemos, cómo procesamos el lenguaje, los seres humanos, lo sabemos gracias a la forma en que los estudiantes de Yale, Harvard, Oxford han resuelto algunos tests en un laboratorio en esas universidades de prestigio. Nuestra visión de la psicología del Homo sapiens, que es lo que nosotros aspiramos como lingüistas, como científicos cognitivos, entender la naturaleza humana, está basada en un grupo pequeñísimo de la población mundial que habla básicamente una sola lengua. Entonces, esta caracterización, tal vez un tanto exagerada, que yo estoy presentando, empezó a ser criticada desde las ciencias cognitivas. Y surgió esta idea de las... perdón, me dicen que me abotone la camisa. Estoy gordito, entonces estas cosas pasan. Sí, perdonen. Entonces les seguía contando, ya voy a acabar. En las propias ciencias cognitivas surge un acrónimo muy simpático para empezar a llamar la atención sobre este sesgo tan grande que tenía la psicología contemporánea. Entonces, Joe Hendrick, que es un psicólogo estudioso de las ciencias cognitivas de la Universidad de Harvard, viene y dice que en realidad nosotros habíamos estudiado solamente weird societies. Y weird, que significa raro en inglés, venía del acrónimo de Western, Educated. Yes, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. Y que todo lo que nosotros sabíamos sobre la cognición humana se basaba en poblaciones que habían tenido este tipo de características. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que había que hacer? Mirar el comportamiento cognitivo, el comportamiento, la forma de concebir, de percibir la realidad, de relacionarse con ella en sociedades tan distintas como las sociedades amazónicas, las sociedades de Nepal, las sociedades de distintos lugares del mundo, Papúa Nueva Guinea, que además hablan lenguas mega diversas. Y así se fue construyendo un paradigma diferente que empezó a mirar la relación entre diversidad lingüística y diversidad cognitiva. Esto fue impulsado principalmente por Levinson, Steve Levinson, que fue además como he was like a academic father for you, right? Steve Levinson dirigía el Instituto Max Planck de Psicolingüística y hubo muchos de estos estudios comparando distintas poblaciones que hablaban distintas lenguas en el mundo. ¿Y qué creen? Pues cada vez que miramos la diversidad lingüística, cada vez que miramos la diversidad cultural, etnográfica del ser humano, le damos un poquito más de razón a Benjamin Lee Worf ese lingüista que fue vapuleado, que fue insultado, tratado como un loco por la academia norteamericana. Si bien sí estaba un poco loco, no estaba 100% loco. Tenía razón en algunas de sus ideas principales. Y lo que nosotros empezamos a ver, gracias al trabajo de personas como ASFA, es que efectivamente las diferencias culturales y las diferentes lenguas que hablamos los seres humanos, hablamos más de 7.000 lenguas en este momento, tienen o pueden tener efectos ligeros, efectos no tan ligeros en la manera como percibimos y nos relacionamos con el mundo. Y ese es el trabajo que viene impulsando ASFA, una visión intercultural, cross-cultural de la cognición humana, la socialización y sobre todo la percepción. Uno de sus trabajos favoritos, y con esto termino, tiene que ver con la importancia que tiene el oler. Nosotros vivimos en sociedades que están sumamente guiadas por la visión, ¿no? Entonces, a veces preguntamos cuál es tu visión de las cosas y no nos referimos a algo puramente visual, nos referimos a pensamiento, a concepción y dejamos de lado otros sentidos que también son importantes. Entonces, ASFA se decidió investigar sobre la percepción olfativa en las lenguas del mundo, encontrando que muchas lenguas tienen un complejo léxico asociado a olores y tienen particularidades en la manera como procesan y nombran estos olores. Yo creo que van a disfrutar mucho esta charla. Yo soy un admirador de ASFA, tuve la oportunidad de conocerla en Harvard, estuvimos juntos y bueno, ahora tenemos una amistad que es también una de las razones por las cuales ella está aquí. Ella está muy interesada en continuar trabajando en esta línea de investigación centrada en diversidad lingüística y cultural, empezando a mirar preguntas que se centran en los pueblos amazónicos peruanos, por ejemplo, cuestiones que tienen que ver con relaciones entre chamanismo y percepción de la realidad, diferencias entre aproximaciones distintas a las ideas de lo humano y lo que no es humano en distintos pueblos del mundo y tenemos la idea de continuar colaborando y de continuar contribuyendo al conocimiento de esto que es lo que aspiramos, ¿no? Nosotros yo creo que aspiramos a no tener una psicología, una visión de la psicología de las poblaciones weird, de las poblaciones ricas, industrializadas, educadas, de la sociedad occidental, sino a realmente construir una visión de la psicología evolutiva del Homo sapiens, que nos ayude a entender mejor nuestra naturaleza humana. Y ese es un poco el espacio en el cual la charla que van a escuchar el día de hoy se engarza. Así que, ASFA, te doy las gracias por estar aquí y por haber aceptado nuestra invitación. La PUC es tu casa y, bueno, yo no sé si tengo derecho a decir eso, supongo que tal vez lo debió decir el rector, pero de todas maneras estamos muy contentos y por favor te invitamos a hablarnos. Por si acaso, la charla va a ser en inglés, pero me parece que las personas que lo necesiten pueden solicitar un sistema de traducción automática.
Thank you. And after emphasizing the differences in languages, I'm sorry to be speaking in English, but my Spanish you don't want to hear. So I want to talk about the relationship between the language that we speak and how we think. Language has these two different faces. So it's the tool that we use to communicate with one another, but it's also the thing that we use to think in our minds. And these different facets of language have different implications for what we think the properties of language and thought are. So as Roberto already pointed out, there's fierce debate about the relationship between language and thought and the properties of language itself. On the one hand, people think that language is somehow innate and universal. So this view is often characterized by Noam Chomsky, who says language and thought are awakened in the mind and follow a largely predetermined course. It grows in the mind on the basis of our biological nature, triggered by appropriate experience and in a limited way shaped by experience. On the other hand, we have people that think that language is mostly learned and relative across cultures. So Steve Levinson and Nick Evans argue to the contrary that languages differ so fundamentally from one another at every level of description, sound, grammar, lexicon, meaning, that it's very hard to find any single structural property that they share. So these two very different perspectives, my own research has led me to a different conclusion. There is evidence for innate structure, but plenty of evidence for relativity in the adult system. So how can we reconcile these? So the kind of evidence that we can see is that in babies, there's already experimental evidence that there's some concepts there before children have acquired the words or the grammars of their language. So if we look at infants of 4 months, 9 months of age, we can see they already have color concepts in their minds. They already have ideas about how sound and space should be associated with one another. So if I show babies videos like this, we seem to have lost our sound. Can we get it back again? Try it again. We had sound before, but it doesn't seem to be here anymore. Should I try again? Okay, compare that to this. So one of these should seem better to you than the other. And in fact, let's try that one more time. So if we show these videos to babies like here, so this infant is sitting, the mother is behind wearing headphones so that she can inadvertently hear what the baby can hear. There's a computer screen in front of the baby. You can see it flashing. So that's what the baby can see. So you'll see a little thing moving around the screen like this. So that's just so that we can make sure we can see the baby's eyes. You can see the baby's fascinated, very exciting. There's something moving around on the screen. And then when we're sure that we can see the baby's eyes properly, the light shines again in the middle of the screen and the video just plays. And it goes up and down until the baby gets bored and looks away for more than a few seconds. And by doing that, we can show that babies prefer to watch the videos where, as the ball moves up in space, the pitch of the sound becomes higher in space too. So even before this baby has learned how to talk about auditory pitch, using a high versus low metaphor, as in English, we'll come back to this, there seems to be some preferences in the baby for how these things should be associated with one another. Now that's the kind of evidence that suggests that infants have some innate structure. But on the other hand, there's plenty of evidence of differences across cultures. And here, though, the record base has been rather thin. So if we plot the world's mass based on the number of languages that are spoken in the world, you'll see that Europe looks relatively small now, whereas Papua New Guinea is huge. And that's because there's thousands of languages spoken in this part of the world. But if we see where the data from experimental studies comes from, when we're testing human adults, you can see that 68% of the studies come from North America, another 14% from Europe, from the UK, 13% from the rest of Europe, 3% from Asia, that's mostly China, only 1% from South America, 1% from the Middle East, and that's mostly Israel, and then such a small number, less than 0.2% from the rest of Africa. So these are really small numbers. Now this is data from 2008, where this study took a record of all of the studies in the world, and it caused a huge excitement in the field, and many people hadn't realized that the record was so skewed. But since then, nothing has changed. So in a more recent study, you can see that the number of studies have gone down from 68% to 67%, but nothing has changed in the rest of the world. And as Roberto pointed out, Joe Henrich and colleagues have coined this the weird problem, that most of our studies and most of our theories about how the mind works is based on people like this. They're undergraduate students at North American universities. And moreover, our theories are based on English mostly. English, however, is only one of around 7,000 languages spoken today. At the moment, one language goes extinct every 3 months, and that rate is accelerating. 50% of the world's languages will be extinct or seriously endangered by the end of this century. And almost 40% of languages are undescribed. We don't even know what the properties of these languages are. And this is such a sadness, whereas we know so much more about outer space than we do about the humanity on our own planet. This is most egregious when we start thinking about how children acquire language. Children are growing up in very different contexts. Yet if we look at the studies of children's language acquisition, you can see there are thousands of studies on English, and here's Spanish down here. Millions of speakers in the world, but we know hardly anything about the acquisition of Spanish in comparison to the acquisition of English. It's a call for us to learn more about how the languages in the world are spoken. And this is something that I think Peru and this university has a great opportunity to really contribute to world knowledge. Now, okay, you think, well, there's many studies of English, surely that's great, I mean, that's good. Only when we compare English to the rest of the world's languages, we see that it's a bit of an outlier. It's not representative of languages in terms of its grammatical categories, its morphology. It looks different to many other languages. So when we build our theories just on English, we may be misled about the properties of language and how it relates to mind. So for me, each language encapsulates a system of knowledge within a specific cultural context. And so going beyond English, both as an object of inquiry and as a tool for investigation, is necessary to decolonize the mind and to make us think more broadly about the nature of mind. So just to make this more concrete, if we think about just the sound systems in languages, we can see that they vary radically from as little as 11 unique sounds in a language to more than 100. And of course, we don't even need sounds to have a fully functioning language. There's around 300 different sign languages that differ from one another in all sorts of properties. If we look at how we put sentences together, you can do this through word order, for example. And you can see that in English you put the subject, the verb, and then the object. But you can put a sentence together in all sorts of different orders, and that can still work in many of the world's languages. So even these simple facts vary considerably. If I want to talk about basic actions, so for example, eating, drinking, and smoking in English, I have to use a distinct verb depending on whether the thing I ingest is solid, liquid, or gaseous. But in Punjabi, I don't. There's just one verb for when you're eating versus if you're ingesting something that's not a solid. And if I speak Jahai, there's not even a single verb for eating. I can't just say I ate my dinner. I have to say whether I ate something that's a green vegetable or fruit or something meaty, starchy. Each of these has a distinct verb. So depending on the language that I speak, I have to make very different categorizations. When it comes to talking about the body, things are different. So in Dutch, like English, there's a distinct word for hand versus arm. But in Japanese, if you look at the word for hand, speakers include the arm as well as part of its meaning. And in Indonesian, there's only one term for hand and arm together. And if we look for how speakers of different languages talk about the upper arm, lower arm, hand, upper leg, lower leg, foot, you can see there's very different categorization systems, even when it comes to discussing our own bodies. So whether it's different types of actions or talking about our body, referring to landscapes or small-scale spatial relations, For how we order events, emotions, and perception, we find considerable variation across the world's languages. And that means we have to really think about the variation that there is today to try and understand how these categories appear in the world. So in my own work, I've been trying to promote the use of field work. So that's using different methods, partly ethnographic observation, linguistic elicitation, field experiments, but also trying to get psychologists to think about just taking experiments out into the museum context, for example. Of course, we use lab experiments where we can get the undergraduates to do things that regular people won't let you do to them. And we also look at corpus data where you can look at naturalistic use of language. And in each of these cases, we go where language lives to improve the ecological validity of our findings and to facilitate inclusive cross-linguistic comparison. And this enables us to look at the nexus of culture, language structure, and daily discourse practice. And this helps us illuminate meanings as forms situated in context and sequence. At the same time, we can be looking for things that never appear naturalistic, so we can target domains where the corpora are silent through elicitation, through experiments, and conduct focused cross-linguistic comparison. And that helps us look at the relationship between language and cognition and enable insights into linguistic processing. And this helps us illuminate referential meaning and uncover lexical structure. So these are different approaches that we can take. And we've used this to look at basic perception. So there's been an idea over the centuries, sometimes attributed to Aristotle, that there's a hierarchy of the senses, that humans are mostly visual creatures. Perhaps sound is important to us since we communicate using sounds, but that touch, taste, and smell is not important for our minds and how we think about the world. In fact, it's a bit of a mistake to attribute this to Aristotle. Aristotle had smell in the middle. He thought that touch and taste, which required contact with an object, were perhaps more subjective, and smell may be closer to hearing and sight. But today, mostly smell goes in the lower end of this hierarchy. And that's because people like Steve Pinker, for example, have claimed that smell is vestigial in humans. It's not important at all. Howard Gardner, a psychologist who's thought about multiple intelligences, you can be clever in emotion as well as cognition, says when it comes to keen gustatory or olfactory senses, these abilities have little special value across cultures. And Diane Ackerman says it most eloquently, smell is the mute sense, the one without words. So these different theorists have claimed that smell is not important for humans and something that we can't talk about. So we tried to test this claim using cross-cultural comparison. We took a standardized battery of tests, standardized instructions. We asked speakers of different languages to describe different colors. So they saw these colors one at a time, different shapes, different sounds that varied in pitch, loudness, and tempo. Tactile texture, so people were blindfolded while they touched different textures and had to describe them. Tastes, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. And smells, so using the scratch and sniff card, you can elicit different smells. So we took this field kit to 20 different cultures around the world. We tried to target languages that were as different as possible from one another. So we have large languages like English and Cantonese, but also many small-scale communities, and 3 different sign languages, British Sign Language, American Sign Language, and Kata Kalok, which is a village sign used in Bali. And that helps us look to see whether the modality of the language affects how people talk about the senses. Of course, this work can't happen just by a single person. It's done collaboratively. So my colleagues who are doing long-term documentation in each of these languages, so they give the instructions to speakers in their native language, and speakers respond in their native language, and that data is then taken and transcribed in a systematic way, and we code that data so we can compare quantitatively whether there's the same hierarchy of the languages across culture. So in the experiment, what we're looking to see is, do we find the same hierarchy where vision is most easy to talk about, followed by sound, touch, taste, and smell? So we can map this quantitatively. So I'm just going to briefly describe how we do this. We are able to calculate a score where 1 means that every single speaker within a community agreed in how they described a stimulus, and 0 means everybody gave a completely different response. So what we're going to do is look to see how do speakers of English, for example, talk about the different senses, and we find, in fact, when we examine this statistically, they recapitulate this hierarchy. So vision is the most codable, followed by sound, and then the other senses are the least codable. But it's only English that fits the predicted pattern better than chance. Out of the 20 languages that we studied, we find 13 different rank orders of the senses. So for example, if we look at Farsi, taste is the most codable, as it is in Lao. So we won't say what this means about English food, that taste is so low, and in Farsi and Lai it's so high. But we can see that this varies across cultures. So for example, if we look at Umpala, a language spoken in Australia, smell is the most codable, and the visual domains are the least codable. So considerable variation across cultures. So what we want to try and see is if we can account for this cross-linguistic variation by thinking about cultural parameters. And we can think about both macro properties and micro properties. So for macro properties, we can ask, does it matter what the population size is of the language community that speaks a language? So perhaps large languages show more agreement in how they talk about things. Or communities that have formal schooling and literacy, maybe that makes a difference to how the senses are coded. At micro level, we can ask for each domain, are there cultural variables that would predict the differences in how speakers talk about the senses? So for example, it's been suggested that color naming is related to color technology. So if you live in a natural environment, you don't need colors if you want to talk about the bananas. You can just talk about ripe bananas and unripe bananas. But when you start applying colors artificially to things, then perhaps it doesn't make sense to talk about ripe and unripe t-shirts. Now you need to have vocabulary to be able to talk about the green and the yellow t-shirt. So when we take color away from its natural context and we artificially apply it, now you need to develop a language for colors. And in a similar way, we could ask, well, is talking about shapes related to traditional crafts where people are creating their own shapes? Or is sound naming related to having specialist musicians in a culture? So for each of our domains, we created an ethnographic questionnaire where we find out for that specific culture what the practices were. And then we try to use that to predict the language data. So we can see here that we can in fact predict many aspects of the language. So for example, overall, people agree more in how they talk about the senses the larger the population size and the more formal schooling there is. We also find that in cultures that have specialist musicians, everybody in the culture is able to describe sounds more accurately than when they don't have specialist musicians. Formal schooling also specifically influences how people talk about shapes. More formal schooling, the more agreement there is in how we describe shapes. But also, if you have a culture that makes crafts, including pattern pottery, then people are better able to describe shapes. And if you live in houses that are angular rather than circular, then you're also better able to name angular shapes than if you live in a circular house. And if you live in a hunter-gatherer culture, then you're better able to describe smells than if you don't live in a hunter-gatherer culture. So it seems as if cultures help and predict some of these things. So one surprising thing that came out was that it didn't seem to be the case that color naming was related to color technology. And that's a bit surprising because the technology hypothesis has been quite a prevalent one in anthropology. So it's been suggested that discriminating abstract colors is a mental habit which makes sense in a world full of manufactured objects like the one that we live in now. And that it's rare that naturally occurring objects or the artifacts of technologically simple societies are distinguishable only by color. And that if you have an extensive biological vocabulary, you might not need to have color terms. So we studied this in Thailand in a small community called the Mani. There's around 300 speakers of this language today. The Mani are still a traditional hunter-gatherer community. And my PhD student at the time, Evelina Vanuk, was doing primary field work with this community and found that contrary to these claims, the Mani had a color vocabulary that was quite sophisticated, and as sophisticated as you find in Vietnamese, for example. And if we compare all of the hunter-gatherer cultures where color vocabulary has been tested, we see that hunter-gatherers actually can have small vocabularies, but also quite large ones, as we see with the Monique here, and even some other ones that seem to do better. So the idea that an extensive botanical vocabulary, so names for plants and animals, might mean that you don't need color terms actually doesn't fit the ethnographic data very well at all. So if you look at small-scale farmers and compare them to hunter-gatherers, you find that the small-scale farmers actually have 3 times larger vocabularies for plants and animals than the hunter-gatherers. So if that was the case, you'd expect the farmers to have a smaller color vocabulary than the hunter-gatherers, but that doesn't fit the data at all. So people that are making speculations about what hunter-gatherers are like or what farmers are like, they're not basing it on the actual evidence that we have, they're just making things up in their own minds. So the claim that it's rare that naturally occurring objects or people in simple societies don't distinguish things by colors doesn't fit. So we see for the Mani, for example, that they use color words to distinguish different types of tubers or different species of monkeys. And that's relevant for them. So when they're in the forest, they might say, oh, look, red thing, and only later identify what that red thing is, which species of animal it is. So the Mani show us that a society with simple material technology, including simple dyeing technology, can nevertheless have a large color lexicon and high color naming efficiency, which tells us the importance of getting primary data so that we know how things actually work in the world. Now, before I showed you that babies seem to be sensitive to sounds and how they associate to space. And I already alluded to the fact in English, when we talk about pitch, we talk about high versus low pitches. And some people have speculated that this is a natural thing that all people would do in all cultures. And that's because high pitches seem to come from higher in space. So in this study conducted in Germany, the researchers put directional microphones on people as they just walked around the city during the day. And they found that high-pitched sounds came from higher in space than low-pitched sounds. And in fact, the researchers suggested that the shape of our ears, these like weird whorls that we have that we've never quite understood, that this might be an evolutionary adaptation to exactly pick up these auditory scene statistics, the fact that high-pitched sounds come from higher in space, and maybe that's why our ears look the way that they do. So that suggests there's a biological explanation for why English speakers use high and low to talk about auditory pitch, because that reflects something about the way that the world is. But in our large cross-cultural study, we found that this wasn't actually the default way to talk about auditory pitch. More commonly, people used volumetric metaphors, so something like small versus big sounds, or thin versus thick sounds. That seemed to be much more common in the world's languages, at least in the sample of languages that we looked at. And you can think about how both metaphors can have their sources in our experience. So bigger animals usually produce lower pitches. So we can see, for example, this bird up here, it makes this kind of sound, whereas this elephant makes this sound. So there seems to be this correlation between the frequency of the sound the animal makes and how big that body is. There's one exception, which is this koala bear, which sounds like this. Not what I was expecting koala bear to sound like, but anyway, that's what it sounds like if you were curious. There's also an association between the sound and the thickness of strings and stringed instruments. So you can hear this here. So the thickness of the string causes either a high frequency sound to be produced or a lower frequency sound to be produced. So all of these different ways of talking about sounds can have their basis in our perceptual experiences. But we wanted to know whether different ways of talking about sounds might affect the way that people think about sounds. So we conducted an experiment where we showed people lines on a screen, something like this, while they heard a note, like this. And then they saw a cue, and they had to sing back the note that they just heard. Okay, so we play them different sounds, and people sing back the sounds that they heard. So when you do this in the lab, people say, oh, don't make me sing, I'm a terrible singer. And you say, no, do it anyway, we want you to. And if you do that, you can see that as the sound of the pitch is higher, people sing back the notes higher. So there's a relationship between what they hear and what they sing back, which is good. But what we want to know is what happens when we give them lines at different heights on the screen, or we give them lines that are different thicknesses on the screen. So we show them one line at a time while they're hearing a sound, and we look to see how that influences their singing back of that note. And what we find is that for Dutch speakers, who like English speakers use a high-low metaphor to talk about sounds, when they hear and then reproduce the sound, so no words involved, they sing back the same note higher when they see a line high on the screen than when they see a line lower on the screen. But for Farsi speakers who use a thin, thick metaphor, this makes no difference to how they sing back notes. Instead, for the Farsi speaker, they sing back the same note higher when they see a thin line on the screen than when they see a thick line. But for the Dutch speakers, this doesn't make any difference. So it seems that the way that we talk about sounds influences the way that we think about sounds. Finally, I just wanted to briefly talk about smells. So the thing that I alluded to earlier, where it's been claimed that these are not important across cultures and that we don't have a vocabulary for them. In my own field work in Malaysia with the Jahai, with my colleague Nicholas Bernholt, who's actually the real expert of this language and has written a grammar of this, we found that the Jahai, in fact, do have a vocabulary for smells. So they have around a dozen different verbs to describe different qualities of smells. So for example, the smell hae is for the smell of unpleasant things like shrimp paste and tree sap and this tiger, which does smell really bad, by the way. Then there's ba'us smells, which are also bad, but of a different type. So some hornbills smell of this, mushrooms, cooked cabbage, cooked rice. That's different from lakput smells, which are associated with fragrant flowers, soap, this bear cat that smells like popcorn, durian. Ba'i smells are different again. They're kind of bloody sorts of smells associated with fresh meat, some species of toads, fish, and otter. That's different again from jenges smells. These are stinging sorts of smells associated with smoke, the stem of some wild ginger, the cave of bats or bat feces. So very different sorts of smells again. So we wanted to see how speakers use these terms. So we compared Jahai speakers to Dutch speakers in an experiment where we gave people monomolecular odors. So we took molecules, single molecules from olfactory space, and we presented them to people in pens. So you can take just a marker pen that you can write on a whiteboard, but instead of having ink in it, you can give different smells inside of it. So you'll see this in this video. You'll see my hand coming in from the side with one of these pens, and this Jahai speaker will describe the smell that he is smelling. Number 2. Okay, straightforward. You think that's a very simple task? Here's the same odor now with a Dutch participant. Number 3. Okay, you can see it's very different between the Jahai speaker and the Dutch speaker. And in case you're curious about what that smell is, it's this molecule acetone, which experts say smells food-like or buttery or milky, so not like cinnamon at all. And this ba'us smell is kind of like a musty sort of smell, so maybe the Jahai speakers are more agreeing than the Dutch. So if we look at what the Jahai speakers do, they all use one of their main smell terms to describe these different smells that we've given them. These are completely novel odors to the Jahai as to the Dutch. But the Dutch speakers use all sorts of different descriptions. So sometimes they talk about the source, it smells like cinnamon. Sometimes they talk about a particular scenario, it smells like my grandmother's house. Sometimes they just say it's familiar, and so forth. And if we measure the time it takes speakers to provide responses, we can see something very different. So for the 30 different Jahai speakers that we tested and the 30 different Dutch speakers, on average, Jahai speakers take 2 seconds to give a response, whereas Dutch speakers take 13 seconds just to say, I don't know. If you measure until they give you a real response, it takes them 30 seconds to give that response. We can also look at the facial expressions that people gave. So do the Jahai and the Dutch participants smell these odors in different ways, or do they have the same evaluative experience but then just come to different descriptions in the end? So we coded the facial expressions of all of the speakers in all of the videos, and you can see actually that there's something quite interesting that happens with their facial expressions to some of the odors. So here's a Jahai participant. I think you can guess whether that's a nice smell or not. And this is the term that he was using, and in fact the odor that we'd given him is a trimethylamine, which smells like rotten fish, which is why he gave that expression. Now here's the same odor with a Dutch participant, and again quite recognizable how he finds that smell.
Bijna ammoniak achtergevonden. Ammoniak ruikt scherper, maar... Oké. Nee. Ik kan nog niet echt definiëren wat er nou precies is. Het stinkt in ieder geval.
Okay, so if we look at the different facial muscle movements that we coded, you can see that for the unpleasant smells, speakers of the two communities have the same facial expressions to the same odors. So what does that tell us? For smells, it seems that even though there's an initial universal emotional reaction to the odors, we get later culture-specific packaging for language. More importantly, it says that what we're finding with our undergraduate participants in university context is not what we find worldwide. The Jahai tell us it is possible to talk about smells, and that raises questions of where in our own communities we might find smell experts. And one place might be wine experts. So it's been claimed that wine experts have a very developed nose and that they are able to talk about smells in very precise time. So this is Robert Parker, an American wine critic, who uses vocabulary like angular and austere and backward. If you don't know what these words mean, I don't either. So these are terms that Robert Parker has used to describe wines. At the same time, some people say that wine trade is intrinsically bullshit prone and therefore attracts bullshit artists. So William Gluck, who's a wine writer for The Guardian in the UK, says, "We wine writers are the worst qualified of critical experts. This is largely, though not exclusively, because we are the most poorly equipped. The most important tool at our disposal is inadequate for the job. That tool is the English language." So is it the case that wine experts do have a vocabulary that can be used precisely, or are they just talking bullshit? To test that, we looked at wine reviews and the corpus to see if we could predict properties of the wine from wine reviews, and we brought wine experts into the lab as well as conducting experiments, and it turns out wine experts do have the expertise that they claim to have, but only for wines. It doesn't generalize to everyday smells. But that does, again, bring us to the point that if we're developing theories about what's possible in the mind, we do have to go outside of our undergraduate populations and start thinking about different contexts of knowledge use in the adult system. So that might mean studying wine experts, it might mean making a trip to the jungle and working with Jahai. To conclude, our theories of language and thought must take human diversity seriously. The mapping of language onto the senses is culturally relative, and across cultures, language shapes our mental life. Thank you.
So, ustedes tienen la posibilidad de hacer preguntas a través de ese QR o hay 6 preguntas. Perdón, 5. La primera pregunta. ¿Empezamos? Sí, ¿no? What research have you done about nonverbal autistics and the way they communicate? How can people harness or support the unique abilities of nonverbal autistic despite the lack of a spoken language?
This is going beyond my own research, but I think it does bring up some really challenging and questions about the limits of language. So, of course, in the research that I talked about today, I've been focusing on those things that are verbalizable. So in words, I didn't even go beyond that to think about grammatical constructions. But there's a whole arsenal of non-verbal communicative tools that humans have in order to express themselves. So this is maybe in the domain of pragmatics, but also thinking about how we express ourselves through gesture and other communicative signs. And there's certainly a very interesting and exciting possibility space to think about how much that itself is shaped by different cultural contexts. So are the gestural forms that we use in different cultures the same or different, for example? How much easier are those to acquire than speech, for example? So those are things of active investigation. There are people that are looking at gesture and how it's shaped and reflected in different cultures, and I think that would be a very interesting place to look at nonverbal autistic children too.
Thank you. So there is another question about clothes. What can you, we are getting more questions. What can you say about the language of clothes and how the way people dress communicates identity, emotions, or social messages?
So I think language, the term language is used in different ways. So when we talk about language in the sense that I was using it today as a symbolic system that codes, that has a form, so the sounds that encodes meaning, that's different to when we talk about the language of clothes or the language of music, where you don't have that duality of patterning. So you don't have a sound and a meaning necessarily in the same way. But in terms of just the categorization of clothes, I mean, there's interesting variation even within a single language. So I speak British English. When we were in the US, you can see there's many different ways that clothes are talked about. So for me, pants mean underwear, but for American English speaker, it means trousers. A vest is a waistcoat in my dialect, but for Americans it means a kind of sweater. So even though it's one language, ostensibly just English, there's different ways that gets categorized even within that same language. And so again, it's another point of variation that could be interesting to study.
This question is a little bit difficult. You know, I think that if I am interpreting well this question, is more like how about other domains, like other domains related to, you know, other words and concepts related to the world and you know, other domains of human life. Do you think that you will find also a similar impact or a similar, you know, similar results in that domain?
it seems to hold up across domains. So any place that I've looked, so different scholars have different ideas about what things are most fundamental and most likely to be shared. So some people think that perception, because it's based in biology, will be shared, but as I've shown today, that seems to have a lot of variation across cultures. Other people have suggested maybe the Kantian domains of space and time would be more shared. But if we look at those, we also find variation in how they're categorized. So I've yet to find a place where we don't find that variation. I think it's more interesting to start thinking about what structures that variation. So one thing that seems to be missing in kind of modern large-scale cultural contexts or urban contexts like the one in Lima or the one in Oxford where I'm now, is that people seem to have lost knowledge about biological vocabulary. So people don't know the names of trees anymore or the names of birds, whereas people in rural communities or even within our language a generation or two ago, people had that vocabulary. So how our life ways and the way that we interact with the world is influencing vocabulary, and knowledge is also changing and changes our language with it.
Yo voy a adaptar un poquito las preguntas para tratarlas de relacionar un poco más a la expertise de ASFA. So I will summarize this one. Why Chomsky was so revolutionary?
Why was he so revolutionary? Why was Chomsky the way that Chomsky was? Yeah, great question. I mean, Chomsky's not unique in emphasizing the shared aspects of language. There is something unique about the fact that only humans have language in the way that we do. So as far as we know, no other animal has the communicative repertoire that we do. People have been studying bird song or whale song, and there's interesting structures, but nothing like what humans have developed. So there's something definitely that's shared between us all, and yet we find such variation that I struggle to understand your Spanish, Roberto. So the fact that we have so many different languages is something that different people emphasize. So you either focus on the shared similarities, and I think in terms of the sociology, I think there's something to be said about the particular moment in time that Chomsky was emphasizing, shared capacity. So after the Second World War, where people are kind of trying to perhaps emphasize common humanity at the expense of differences and variation. And so maybe it was something about striking that particular nerve at that particular historical moment that made those ideas so, so powerful. But of course, both of those things are true. We differ from one another as well, and that's exciting and something to celebrate.
And regarding your field research and your methodology, do you need to do some kind of control test or something in your studies when you work with people who might have different sensibilities? And for example, you go to a village I don't know, in the Amazon, but maybe no one has like the same capacity. Maybe someone has a problem in smelling or can't see very well, or hearing problems. Is that also something relevant?
Yes, so we try to account for that in our studies. So we look at, so for example, in the colour vocabulary that we've looked at, there are tests to be able to establish whether someone has normal color vision. So around 7% of Europeans, mostly male, are colorblind and so can't distinguish red, green. That rate of colorblindness is much smaller in small-scale communities, so it's less than 1%. So it's something that seems to happen in European communities, perhaps because of well, there's a long, complicated story, but anyway, there's variation in how much color blindness is. On the other hand, you also find in modern Western urban contexts that people are all short-sighted. So many people here are wearing glasses, I'm wearing contact lenses. So we're spending a lot of time on our screens, and that's affected our vision. We know that if you spend more time outdoors, your eyesight is improved, and so people living in small-scale communities don't need glasses in the same way. So absolutely our lifestyle affects our perceptual abilities, and as we age, we lose sensory sensitivities. So we do try to take that into consideration. I mean, one interesting thing is that language seems to be quite robust to this variation. So within a population, even if you have different perceptual abilities, so for example, if you look at completely blind individuals, they have no vision at all, they were born with no vision, they still have knowledge about vision language. So they know that trees are green and apples are red and these are color words, and they know that the difference between to glimpse and to stare is a duration of looking. So just from language input, they're able to acquire a lot of the meanings about vision related terms, even though they don't have direct perceptual experience. So language is doing something, it's not just about our own perceptual abilities, it's codifying something about how we communicate about these things, and people without that direct experience nevertheless have some of that knowledge.
Very interesting. And I think that you explained this, but I will ask you the question anyway because it's interesting. It has been said that basic cognitive processes do not have any problems. I mean, the research on basic cognitive processes does not have the problem of the weird population. What do you think about this? So, do you think that this weird population effect might also have impact regarding basic cognitive processes, or like more general things?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does. I mean, our sight, for example, is one of them. So we have higher rates of short-sightedness than people that don't live in a Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic society. Health outcomes is another. So the way that we process language is different when you have literacy than when you don't have literacy. So there's many, even how you pay attention to things in the world varies as a function of literacy, which comes from being in an educated context. There are many, many examples of cases where even in our basic perceptual or basic cognitive abilities, there's variation across cultures. So many of the things that we might take for granted are shaped in the cultural environment that we're in. If we had been born by accident in a different cultural context, our mental lives would be shaped accordingly.
This one is also an interesting one because we also have been discussing about this before. How about the language related to emotions and feelings? Is there any research showing that there are also differences in that regard among languages? And
there's a huge literature on emotions. There's some very interesting early work on hunter-gatherer communities where there seems to be a different emotional vocabulary. So the Jahai and the Mani are in the Malay Peninsula, and a nearby language related to them has been said to only have 8 words for emotions. English has thousands documented, so just the size of the vocabulary differs. one thing that seems to be pretty stable across languages is that when emotion words turn up, we have many more different types of ways to be negatively experiencing the world than positively experiencing the world. So you're sad and angry and depressed, but only happy in basic emotion. So when we make distinctions, it seems to be in this negative space rather than in the positive space. And that tells us something interesting about human nature.
There are a lot of very interesting questions, but I don't want to take more of your time, so we are maybe a little bit tired. But I will ask you one more. And I apologize to the people who sent their questions, and I didn't have time to go through them. But what would be the interaction between the kind of research you do and the developments regarding artificial intelligence? Is there any kind of relation, connection, thing that you can comment on?
So large language models, which are very important at the moment, so underlie, for example, ChatGPT, are based on English. So it's taking the data that there is in one specific language. And I mean, there's amazing things that we're able to do, but there's also limitations in what that means. So if we take seriously linguistic variation, then that's not being captured at the moment. So there's potentially interesting things, and I think you can get lured into the fact that translation seems to be getting a bit better using these large language models, where they were really terrible even a few years ago. They seem to be improving, but again, it depends on the resources. So for languages where there's large resources, more like Spanish, the translation's a little bit better than most languages which are under-resourced and where we don't have as much written material. So I think that's going to be a challenge and an exciting one to think about. How do we take linguistic diversity seriously as we're developing these models?
Okay, so son 5:45. Yo creo que es un buen momento para terminar. Les agradezco a todos por su presencia. Asfa, te agradezco mucho por la excelente charla. Thank you very much for your sharing with all your research and your knowledge. Okay. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas, y hasta la próxima.
Muchas gracias, doctora Majid y doctor Sarikei, con esta inspiradora conferencia que nos deja muchas tareas pendientes respecto a nuestras lenguas originarias. Queda inaugurado nuestro Encuentro Anual de Investigación, Innovación y Creación. Recuerden que pueden conocer toda la programación de nuestro encuentro a través de nuestra página web. Es encuentro-medio-iic.puc.edu.p. No se olviden de compartir sus experiencias durante el encuentro con el hashtag EAIIC2024 y los invitamos a seguirnos, a seguir el Vicerrectorado de Investigación en Instagram, Facebook y LinkedIn. Un anuncio también muy importante: mañana desde las 9 de la mañana tenemos la presentación de trabajos de la Universidad Toribio Rodríguez de Mendoza. Va a suceder en el aula B100. En la tarde, en el mismo lugar, se va a ofrecer una charla sobre la clonación del caballo de paso peruano a las 3 de la tarde. Los esperamos en las diversas actividades que vamos a llevar a cabo. Agradecemos su asistencia. Muy buenas tardes.